Hi, good afternoon. My name is Andrew Barendse. I am a director of the IIC. I'm also the head of the IIC chapter in South Africa. I would like to extend a warm welcome to this webinar. It's regulation in times of pandemic and lessons for the future. So it's the African responses with a particular focus on Southern Africa. Please note that this is one of 3 webinars. There will be 2 other webinars on the same topic, the same theme, but it will comprise of different panelists and moderators. The one will deal with West Africa and the other one will deal with East Africa. But what an extraordinary time to regulate, what an extraordinary time to operate with unprecedented levels of cooperation, coordination and support between regulators and operators. And so the question really is, what are the lessons that we learn as we transition into this new normal? We have an excellent panel of confirmed speakers here this afternoon. And all that remains for me now is to introduce you to our moderator. We are very fortunate. We have a very experienced moderator in the person of Steve Song. Steve Song has extensive background experience in Africa. He is a fellow for Mozilla Foundation. So Steve, let me hand over to you. I will join again at the end to conclude the session. Thank you very much. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And it's a privilege to be able to moderate this session. The pandemic has affected all of us in very profound ways. And the telecommunications sector in particular is undergoing a transformation as a result, I think, of the pandemic, in that while telecommunications has been recognized as an important topic, the pandemic has suddenly catapulted it into the forefront of our ability to cope with COVID-19, to deliver education to our children, to be able to operate remotely just as we are operating now, and to be able to collaborate, to access health information, to engage in collaborative research. Telecommunications now has become essential to whatever this new normal is. And that's taken regulators and operators from, in some cases, a kind of background supporting role, and has put them into the spotlight in terms of addressing these critical questions now of not just how do we spread telecommunications infrastructure, but how do we ensure that everyone has access to affordable communication. And so we have a remarkable list of panelists from around Southern Africa today, representing both regulators and operators from the region. And the questions I'm going to put to them are going to focus on the way that they think about telecommunication and regulation is changing as a result of the pandemic. And I'll even probe further, I think, and suggest that while responses to the pandemic have addressed issues of capacity and affordability, it doesn't seem like that much has been done in terms of extending access to the unserved. And what can we do as operators and regulators to accelerate the rollout of access into the least served regions? And to kick that conversation off, I'm happy to introduce Dimakatso Kocha, counselor with the ICASA in South Africa. And over to you, Dimakatso.
Thank you very much, Steve, and greetings to everybody who's on this call. As Steve has introduced myself, my name is Dimakatso Kocha, and I'm a regulator at ICASA, the South African regulator. I think ICASA is an entity that needs no introduction, particularly to the fellows of IIC, because we are one of the members. And then the next one. So basically for South Africa, it all came or began on the 15th of March 2020, when there was a declaration of the state of national disaster by the Minister of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs. And this declaration was followed by the promulgation of the Disaster Management Act. But I think in terms of laying the lay of the land in as far as the impact of COVID, the declaration of the 15th of March led to a total national shutdown. And this resulted in a total shutdown of schools, workplaces, and only essential services such as health, food supplies, and banks were allowed to operate. This created a need for remote working and e-learning, resulting in high demand for access to the internet, and the unintended consequences of this being that there was then congestion in the network, and also the quality of service was then subsequently compromised. And then we see on slide 4 that as a result of the need to respond to the effects or the impact of COVID, then us as the regulator, we had to then look into how we then meet up the challenges brought about by the virus. And then we then opted to release high demand spectrum, and the rationale for the release of this spectrum of the spectrum on temporary basis was mainly to enable operators to cope with expected increase in internet data, traffic, and alleviate network congestions. And also we needed to facilitate the reduction of data costs and facilitate network coverage for connectivity to rural and underserved communities. And again, to ensure that there is sufficient dissemination of information required for dealing with the national disaster. And also again, for children, we needed to make sure that there is virtual learning that continues from a schooling point of view. And then on the next slide, we see that we are outlining the milestones that we went through as the authority. And again, when it comes to the timeline, the milestones in the release of the licensing of the spectrum, the entire process was concluded within a space of 29 days for the declaration of the state of disaster. The process, as I said, began on the 15th of March when there was a declaration. And this declaration was then followed by the promulgation of the disaster management regulations, which laid a regulatory framework for lockdown restrictions. And again, in line with the disaster management regulations, our minister, the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies, issued a policy directive instructing us, the regulator, to promulgate regulations to introduce interventions addressing challenges brought about by COVID in the ICT space. We then published the ICT COVID-19 National Disaster Regulations on the 6th of April as authority, and then we subsequently, 8 days thereafter, then licensed the high demand spectrum. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, this is an unprecedented achievement, bearing in mind that formulation of policy and the formulation of regulations is a very slow process, but in this instance, we're able to act as expeditiously as possible. And then looking on to the next slide, we realize that there were allocations, and the spectrum bands that we released for temporary use by operators was the IMT 700, 800, the 2.3, the 2.6, and the 3.5 bands. And 5 operators were successful in securing access to these bands, namely MTN, Vodacom, Telkom, Rain Networks, as well as Liquid Telecoms. And we also allowed 3 operators to operate TV white spaces on the 470 to 694 megahertz band. And then, of course, with every allocation, there needs to come terms and conditions as well as obligations. So when we move on to the next slide, we realize that with the licensing of the temporary spectrum came terms and conditions as well as obligations. It is worth pointing out that these temporary licenses are valid up until the 30th of November 2020, or 3 months after the end of the national state of disaster, whichever would come first. And again, in terms of the obligations and the terms and conditions, licensees need to ensure that they do spectrum sharing wherever feasible. Furthermore, licensees need to ensure coordination with broadcasters, particularly those that we've licensed in the 700 and the 800. And those that have been licensed in the 2.3 are supposed to also ensure coordination with fixed operators. And then the 2.6 and the 3.5 need to self-coordinate in order to avoid interference. And again, with those licensed to operate TV white spaces, they need to ensure that they prioritize connectivity to underserved communities. And of course, the obligations that come with these temporary license assignments are that the operators are expected to make provision for virtual classrooms, to ensure connectivity to identified rural communities, and to ensure a reduction of data costs, and of course, to also zero rate COVID-19 related websites as well as specific educational websites. This is done in conjunction with the Department of Education. And then in terms of concessions that were made to other licensees, because it's not only the telecoms that we regulate as ICASA, we also regulate the broadcasting as well as the postal sector. And so not only did we introduce reliefs to mobile operators, we also introduced interventions to the television and radio broadcasters as well as the postal services. In as far as broadcasters are concerned, we introduced the relaxation of broadcasting performance period for TV and radio. Basically, performance period is the period within which we measure performance or compliance with the necessary regulations as well as the license terms and conditions of the broadcasters. So again, because with the COVID, there was restrictions in terms of production of films and content, then we had to also ensure that we alleviate some strains on the broadcasters in as far as compliance with local content regulations is concerned. But again, with regards to the messaging, the broadcasters were obliged or are obliged currently to ensure that at least there is sign language in their broadcast services. And then coming to the postal services, because the postal service is the custodian of the national address system, they are obliged by regulations to ensure that they assist anybody that is responsible for the coordination of and the management of the spread of COVID, the Department of Health or any law enforcement officers, agencies, to ensure that they provide the relevant addresses and system for purposes of tracking and tracing persons infected with COVID. And some of the considerations that we made in determining eligibility for allocation are basically outlined in slide 10. And, but I would like maybe to move to the last slide, which is slide 11, which shows the extent to which we as the authority have also been able to ease up restraints in as far as the regulatory constraints are concerned. And since we're implementing extraordinary measures for extraordinary circumstances, as the regulator, we needed to ease some regulatory barriers for the release of the spectrum. And some of the things that we did was the streamlining of approval processes such as approvals, as well as spectrum assignments. We also introduced spectrum fee waivers, where the licensees are not supposed to, and I expected not to pay license fees during this COVID period. And also we encourage spectrum sharing and rapid access to sites. And we also provided realistic conditions associated with spectrum release. At this point, I think I will hand over back to Steve, and then I will field any questions that may come.
Thank you, Dimakatsu. I mean, your presentation really highlights just how comprehensive the challenge is for regulators to regulate the various aspects of access from the postal services to telecommunications to broadcast. But I'd like to drill down just on one issue in particular. I mean, I remember reading the news about the release of spectrum from IIC, and I was just staggered. That was just such a huge amount and so quickly in terms of releasing spectrum. And in your presentation, you mentioned these targets or the priorities of capacity, of costs, and of coverage. And could you comment a little bit about where you've seen the biggest impact as a result of the release of that spectrum and where the biggest barriers were?
All right, Steve. So I think you are spot on. And these bands that we actually speaking about are those that have been earmarked particularly for the auction that will take place sometime this year or next year. But I think in terms of the biggest impact, I think for us as the regulator, I think the turnaround time that it took us to promulgate the regulations and to even assign the spectrum is remarkable. And I think for us, it's quite a remarkable achievement. But other positive spin-offs that I think have emerged out of the release of the emergency spectrum was that operators at least were able to deal with the traffic flows that came as a result of demand for spectrum. But also, I would believe that there has been to some extent, there has been a stimulation of the economic activity, because I think, again, as you read, there has been some increase in revenues on the side of operators and so forth. And I think there has also been some kind of a leapfrogging of technology on the side of operators, because then they've been able to then dive into 5G, which is one thing that was not on the radar until the pandemic struck. So I think they have been able to get the opportunity to conduct trials on the 5G. And I think this pandemic has also showed us that, in fact, 4IR is actually a reality. So I think as the regulator, we are still to receive some comprehensive reports from the operators, and we will actually dig deeper when we get to see the reports as to how is it that they have also benefited. But I think the ones that I've highlighted are the ones that are quite obvious from a regulator point of view.
Thank you. I hope we can hear from the operators as well to respond to that very question as well.
Mm. But I suppose you did ask me as well. Did you ask about barriers? You did, right? Okay, that's fine.
Please go ahead.
No, I was speaking to the barriers because you had asked about the barriers, and I think it goes without saying that for the operators to have had to procure equipment on such short notice, it must have been a nightmare on their side, and I think really that could have been a barrier. And I think also, with regards to the exchange rate, having to procure equipment internationally, that could have, in one way or the other, been a barrier in them, realizing the significant use of the spectrum.
Thank you. And maybe when we get into discussion, we can talk a little bit about how if this happened again, how we would do things differently. But at this point, let me turn to Teboho Moshe, Director of Compliance and Monitoring at BOCRA in Botswana. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Steve. Good day, everyone who managed to join us today. As he has already introduced me, I'm Teboho Moshe from Botswana Communication Regulatory Authority. And I will be sharing with you my presentation outlined as follows. I'll give you a brief on what BOCRA does, the initiatives that we took to address the pandemic, our challenges, and how our new normal looks like, and then I'll conclude. On the introduction, we as BOCRA, we have 3 mobile operators that we are regulating. We've got 27 postal operators, and we also have broadcasters, 11 of them. And then we have a significant number of internet service providers standing at 101. Now going straight to the initiatives. From our point of view, when COVID-19 knocked on our door, we had to engage all our licensees and get to understand their needs. And from that engagement, we listed a number of action items that we had to undertake. And one of them was that we allocated spectrum to those who needed it. This was mainly to ease congestion on the networks. We also registered a domain name, and this was for the use of the ministry to load information on COVID, as well as the public to access. We also had a short code for emergency services, and this was also for the public to get information and ask any questions related that they may need assistance on. As the regulator, we also had to relax in a number of areas, especially for our non-compliant operators, because it's a fact that most companies are not doing so well during this time. And we had to be considerate and not be stringent as we have always been, including even on the payment side. So we are running a little bit low because we are not collecting as we should be. One of the things that we also agreed with our operators was that there will be no price increase across all sectors for all communication services. We also advocated for the increase in the local content quota, which was standing at 40%. It was then moved to 60%, mainly to entertain the people at home, because we know that during lockdown, most people were at home, and they also needed access to information. On the next slide, I will be addressing the initiatives taken by the operators. On the operators, they agreed with us that they will be distributing information, all emergency information at no cost. One of the operators volunteered to host the call center for the ministry, the one that I talked to in the previous slide. And all our mobile operators also agreed to keep all the SIM cards active throughout this period. Under normal circumstances, the SIM cards get deactivated 3 months if there is no activity. However, we did agree that they keep them for as long as the pandemic lasts, mainly because we wanted the information to reach each and every person across the country. Also, there was an increase on the mobile money limits from 4,000 to 10,000. With this initiative, we were trying to keep people away from the streets and be able to transact from the comfort of their homes. Our sectors, all the sectors, contributed 12.7 million in cash, which was donated to the government through the Government Relief Fund. On the next slide, I'll also be referring to the operators. Most of them came up with the e-learning packages for both the learners and the institutions at no cost. And in some cases, it was at a very, very low cost. This was to assist the students at home during the lockdown. Even now, even though the lockdown has been lifted, they are still running. And we ensured that this runs in all platforms, from TV, radio, the mobile. And for those that are in the rural areas, as most of our country, we don't have the 4G, they were using their cell phones, the feature phones that we know, and they were accessing information using the USSD codes. Now moving on to the challenges. As for the challenges, I want to believe all of us were challenged in one way or another. And even Bokra had their own fair share of challenge. We had our network congested during the time. We also had issues with the equipment coming through our borders for our operators. We had also incidents of misinformation whereby people were recording voice notes and sending social media posts, just causing panic and a chaos. but this has since come to an end. We also had one instance where the retailers were using the emergency platform for commercial purposes. Let me move on to the new normal as we see it. For us as the regulator, we are still emphasizing on infrastructure sharing for all our operators. We've also noted that because of this pandemic, there is now over-reliance on the online transactions. And this calls for new robust consumer protection strategies, addressing issues of cybercrime and even educating our own consumers. One of the things that we also focused on was to improve our turnaround time for speedy rollout of services. We are also busy updating our business continuity plans, even for the sector, because we realize that we never imagined that we will have anything like this pandemic, and therefore there were gaps that we need to close. Also, as BOCRA, we are busy exploring more e-platforms that we can use to handle the requests of our licensees. And lastly, we are also engaging the land authorities to assist in releasing land for our telecom sites, as we need to now be increasing coverage because the landscape has now changed. People are working from home, and we need to make sure they are covered. As for the operators, in the next slide, it goes without saying that the traffic pattern has changed, like I've already mentioned, from business to residential. The operators are also busy expanding their networks to increase capacity. We are seeing new products being launched at the moment. And with the rise of e-commerce and digital services, the small, medium enterprises are now moving on to online platforms. And therefore, our operators have to now come up with new ways of serving their consumers. I think I'll go to my conclusion. And I think in conclusion, I just want to once again say that, you know, this over-reliance now is putting us regulators on the spotlight for a fair play. We have to make sure that consumers know what they're getting into as they are engaging online. And for my home country, internet connectivity and the use of smartphones have been, it used to be luxury and now it's more of a basic need, which gives us as the regulator to put more effort and also to push our operators to educate the consumers on the gadgets that they are using, as well as the packages that they are contracting on. On that note, I will close it there. Thank you, Steve. I'll take questions.
And with that in mind, I'd like to come back to Boko to talk a little bit about the release of spectrum. I believe there were 10 megahertz blocks of spectrum released to MNOs. What interests me here is what now? How, as I believe it was an assignment for 6 months of spectrum, which is coming to an end at the end of September. Could you talk a little bit about what the expectations of operators are now, and the plans of BOCRA for the ongoing use of that spectrum? In that, typically spectrum is assigned for large sums of money, and here it's been given away for free, and it's addressing a critical need. It puts regulators in a complicated position, and I wonder if you could talk about that just a little bit.
Thank you, Steve. It's true, we did issue the 10 meg to one of our operators for a period of 6 months. And this was for free, like I earlier mentioned in my presentation. But what we realized was that most of the operators, they didn't utilize the spectrum. In fact, they resorted to optimizing what they already had and also doing the upgrades on their networks. The one particular operator that we gave this spectrum to also had challenges, like you mentioned, that this is a huge investment to roll out to the band that is given on loan for 6 months. So I would say that even though we issued this spectrum, it hasn't really given us value because what they have been doing, they've been operating with what they had all along. Right now, at the moment, we are trying to negotiate with the consent operator to see how best we can assist each other, because under normal circumstances, we don't give spectrum for free. We auction it. And we are in a bit of a dilemma as to which direction we are going to take, because this was meant for COVID and COVID is still here. So it's an ongoing discussion. But for now, like I said, they are optimizing on what they have. Some of them have upgraded to 4G plus. Some are already starting the 5G trials. So we are hanging in there. We'll see how we can resolve this issue. It's a barrier on its own. It's not easy to just give somebody like that and then you expect them to invest for 6 months. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you for that very frank response. And now we're going to turn to Zimbabwe, and Cecilia Nyamutswa is the Director of Legal Services for POTRAZ, the Postal and Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe.
The advent of the coronavirus, aka COVID-19, seems to have caught everyone by surprise. Even though the virus came later to Southern Africa than other regions, we were also caught by surprise and a bit ill-prepared because of the optimism that people in this region had. A number of factors contributed to this. Firstly, there was a general belief that the virus would not affect people of color. Then there was another belief that China and Europe had been hard hit because of cold temperatures in their countries, and that the warmer temperatures in Southern Africa would protect us from the virus. But we all know what happened. The virus hit us. On 26 March 2020, South Africa went on lockdown. On 30 March, Zimbabwe went into total lockdown, followed by Botswana. The rest, in relation to the measures that were taken by Southern African countries, is common knowledge. These lockdowns, together with the accompanying restrictive measures, meant we had to deal with actual and potential loss of life. We had to deal with issues of business continuity, and we had to plan for the future, as no one knew when the pandemic would end. And this is what I have to talk about today. In spite of this, business had to go on. So, commercial transactions, payments, business meetings, educational services all went online. Most people worked from home. Religious gatherings went online, and medical services went online. The bulk of social interactions became virtual. Immediately, it became clear that our networks were getting congested and could not cope with the increased traffic. Something had to be done. It was then noted that unconnected, disadvantaged rural and remote, and in some cases, urban communities could no longer access the services that they used to access physically. These services included education, health services, retail services required for day-to-day goods, services which the urban privileged communities could continue to enjoy virtually. The implications of this was that people who were already marginalized are falling further behind in their education, health access, and other aspects of development. The small businesses that were saving them and the informal traders who had no connectivity closed down completely. And these are the very businesses that we expected to save these communities. While urban dwellers took advantage of virtual shopping, coupled with home delivery of goods and groceries, rural communities could not do that. All this necessitated action on the part of regulators, the government, and business. The communal model of connecting the underprivileged, which had been hailed as a big success in Africa, was exposed as inappropriate or of limited use during pandemics and their attendant lockdowns. For people to use them, they needed to move from their homes, yet movement is restricted. They need to share a room with people who are not members of their family in the community information centers or telecenters. Yet that sharing can increase their risk of catching COVID-19. Not only that, it can not really be effective because of the social distancing measures. The pandemic also saw many internet doctors churning out advice on the internet, and it also saw people relying on the internet more and more for information in various fields. So this also came with the attendant cybersecurity issues, including issues of information integrity, accuracy of information, privacy, and confidentiality. The first action taken by government and the regulators in order to protect lives was the imposition of restrictions. The second, at least for Zimbabwe, was to come up with legislation governing business and social operations, as well as protective protocols during the pandemic. For Zimbabwe, the group of laws that came into being was termed the Public Health COVID-19 Prevention, Containment, and Treatment Regulations 2020. Related to this, critical action was taken to ensure that telecommunication services, including internet and public broadcasting services, were declared as essential services, thereby allowing telecommunication service providers and the regulator to continue operating. This enabled other essential services in various sectors to continue to provide services to our people. The Postal and Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, POTRAZ, went further to take a number of measures, and these included coordinating the response of telecommunication service providers and sector members in order to ensure continuous and seamless connectivity. The regulator also provided free short codes used across all networks to assist with access to COVID-19 command center activities run by the Ministry of Health. Telecommunication network operators agreed to provide connectivity and relevant equipment while absorbing the cost of providing those services. The regulator assisted major mobile network operators and a major public network operator, data operator, with free radio frequency spectrum in the 2100 megahertz band and the 2300 megahertz band, respectively. In its capacity as the trustee of the Universal Service Fund, POTRAZ also drove to increase the number of operational community information centers to cater for the reduction in the number of people accessing those centers due to social distancing measures. The regulator also, in that capacity as trustee, also took steps to speed up the use of telemedicine systems for health centers that had been connected. In order to beef up electronic payment capacity and interoperability, POTRAZ and the banking sector regulator came up with the Money Transmission Mobile Banking and Money Interoperability Regulations 2020. The regulations facilitated increased traffic across banking and telecommunication networks. With regard to safety of transactions, use of electronic systems, and building confidence in the use of ICTs, a cybersecurity and data protection bill, which is set to become law shortly, is now likely to go through its second reading in Parliament. These interventions have enabled the current online systems which are being used for education, business meetings, social meetings, as well as transactions. The next question that we need to deal with then here is whether these interventions are enough. The answer is no. We have much to do. Regulatory frameworks need to be more futuristic or forward-looking, as environmental issues can be very fluid. We need to stress test our regulatory frameworks and processes for future scenarios. The banking industry does that. It's high time we also adopt stress testing. It has become clear that not enough has been done to effectively connect rural and remote areas. And these are at my heart. They are part of the work that I love to do. A telecommunication system, in my view, is as good as its weakest link. As long as we leave part of the population or areas of our countries behind, neither our economic development nor our social development will reach its optimum potential. Under such circumstances, we are unlikely to achieve the sustainable development goals that the world has set. We need to rethink licensing models. There is need to license smaller operators that can make a difference in the pockets around our countries where there is still no connectivity, so that they complement the bigger networks. Another question is, will industry obligations continue? The answer is yes, particularly universal access obligations. They are even more necessary. Governments without industry cannot do this alone. Government lays down the foundation and industry assists in the implementation. Policy and regulatory frameworks need to direct resources and efforts in connecting individual homes, as no one knows how long COVID-19 will stay with us. No one knows how many other pandemics we may face in the future. We appear not to have learned much from the flu pandemic of 1818. If we had, we would have been more prepared than we were this time. Let us learn from this pandemic that if it goes away, we must still plan for the next one, not to sit back until it hits us, and then we start pressing the panic button. That's my message, my final message to you. Over to you, Steve.
I mean, you spoke to my heart when you talked about the importance of inclusion and rural access. And I mean, I couldn't agree more with you that we are as strong as our weakest link in communication. Could you talk a little bit about the most important lessons that you've learned as a result of the pandemic and its impact on you as a regulator?
The one big lesson, which not only Zimbabwe has learned, but other African countries, is that we need to rethink the communal model of connecting, particularly rural and remote areas and the underprivileged. We have all been working to build these centers where people can go and access connectivity because their homes don't have. But this pandemic has shown us that in times of pandemic, that model doesn't work. It can't help us much, if not at all. And this could also happen even in the event of a natural disaster, which may not necessarily be a pandemic, but one that restricts movement or precludes people from moving from one place to another. So we need to rethink that policy, because it's been used across Africa, it's been used across many, many developing countries, but it looks like it needs something else to complement it. And basically what I'm saying is we need to focus our policies our technologies and our resources to actually connecting individual homes. That way, at least we will be happy that people will get connected and they will have access when they need it. Because right now, during the pandemic and during natural disasters, that's when they need connectivity most, and they don't have it.
Thank you, Cecilia. I mean, I think that's a great insight. Just a quick follow-up on that. At the same time, you mentioned the importance of strengthening small operators to fill in those pockets of access where perhaps the larger operators are not going to go. Yet in order to deliver that home access to the individual access you're describing, those small operators need access to spectrum. Do you think there's a way forward in enabling access to spectrum for smaller operators?
Certainly, I think that would be a solution. Because remember, the reason why the big operators don't venture into those remote areas is because it's uneconomic for them. But for a small operator who is saving a particular community, it can be very economic for them to be in those areas so that they then serve as complementary networks. What is then required on the part of the regulator is to license those, and then on the part of the operators, to take these on board as partners somehow, so that the cost of them getting connectivity from the last point of presence of a large operator is not too high for them. I think if we do that, particularly where we license local business people in those areas, will go a long way to connect all the unconnected pockets across the world, I think, and in our country.
Thank you, Cecilia. That was great. And now we will turn to Mozambique and to Salomão David Kumbula, who's the head of research and development at INCM or ARICOM now, I think. I'm never quite sure which one to use. And look forward to hearing your experiences, David.
Thank you, Steve. My name is Salomão David. I work for the Communications Regulatory Authority of Mozambique. You can use INCM, Steve, as for now. I'm gonna share with everyone here what we did during this pandemic stage. I would say that we got the main guidelines on how to operate in the country, basically from the state. Once the state said that we are having a pandemic and there will be restrictions on gathering and movement of people, we had to take some measures. Most of the measures that we took, they were not taken by the regulator enforcing the operators or creating laws and guidelines. We create something called a resolution, something that the regulator can do by sitting with all the operators and deciding which measures are to be taken. And those measures were mostly looking at protecting people from the COVID-19 and trying to make sure that most of the people will stay home and not be roaming around the city. While people were staying home, the Universal Access Fund was deploying around cities, states, points of access for the internet, so that once the restrictions of gathering and movement were altered, we still had a contingency plan to allow people in rural areas to have access to the internet. We have been on this state of emergency for the past 5 months. Until now, there is I mean, there is freedom of movement, but a little bit restricted. We can only start going to the beaches now. Agglomerations cannot be more than 50 to 60 people. So what we did basically was exempt all types of payments, taxes. If you want to acquire in short number, the acquisition fees will be zero. License for postal telecommunication service, including pay for your license, is altered. Type approval for all equipment is done free. And we have created a new way of attending people online. So everything is done online and you receive your type approval through your email. We have allocated spectrum to mobile operators and ISPs for free under what we call gentleman's agreement, where we all sit together and everybody can say what basically they want in terms of spectrum. It's not, let's say, a restricted event. You can send your letter, say what you want, and as long as it's available, we'll allocate to you, but you have to use it, and you can use it for the next during the pandemic stage or even after. We had looked at the amount of spectrum we had when we just had a spectrum auction, and we decided that it's better to have spectrum being used to keep people at home away from this disease, from what we have seen that it is capable of doing in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Being aware about our difficulties in our health system. So we had to do something which would be unprecedented and we haven't done before, but this is the new normal. So we had to be bold and take all kinds of chances. These are our operators. There is no other way we can go and no other way they can go. So no operators were allowed to increase prices of service. Everybody, even your water, nobody could cut it, but everybody was actually paying their bills and making sure that the services were running. And there was a lot of broadcasts on TV channels for kids were increased. Broadcasting companies, unlike mobile companies, they will get a tax sort of exemption at the end of the fiscal year from the regulator. So the idea was to be sure that education, health, and all other service will remain with the same price or free. I will focus most of my presentation on what we have provided in terms of spectrum to mobile operators, not focus too much on postal, but postal service were still running and there are some guidelines for you to be able to receive your packages. In terms of spectrum, we have allocated spectrum on what is mostly request most on mobile operators. They request spectrum on 1800 and 1900. Each operator submit their requests. For some cases, we gave like 400 kilohertz for all the operators, and another one asked for additional 200. All of this spectrum is being used, and they have some kind of agreement with the regulator that they will keep using for at least 1 year after we finish this pandemic stage. Although we are no longer in pandemic stage, we are on a state of calamity. We are still following the same guidelines. In terms of the 17 to 1800, we have allocated to MNOs, 2 of them 7 megahertz, one just requested 5 megahertz. That's what he required to optimize his operations. On the 19 megahertz, we just allocated for all 3 MNOs, either for uplink or downlink, 5 to 5 megahertz. That's what we all had, and it wasn't being used. There was no further purpose for it, so we had to allocate for this season. What we aim with this, what happened with this is we had a huge increase of traffic on net and off net, either on calls. We got data users that we haven't seen in the past, say 5 years. I would say the traffic for 2 months was similar to 1 trimester, or for 1 full semester, just 2 months. We have been able to maintain the data prices and the voice prices stable. We had higher number of connections provided by ISPs, and we had a very high increase in terms of quality of service. We have been working with MNOs on trying to do a cooperative regulation. We are not enforcing anything. We're sitting and discussing and trying to find a way forward for all the problems that the MNOs might have, and for what the regulator actually requires to protect people and let them stay at home. We are still trying to keep our COVID numbers as low as possible, but it's been hard and tough. And with summer, people are trying to go more out, and there is, we are still looking, we're still having difficulties to increase more content for people to stay at home. Basically, this is what we did, and thank you for the opportunity to share our approach during this pandemic stage. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, as I listen to these presentations, it is quite it's quite amazing the range of efforts and activities that regulators have undertaken to mitigate the cost, coverage, capacity issues of in order to make access available during the pandemic. Could you maybe comment briefly on the areas you think that your actions, where your actions had the biggest impact, where you feel like, you know, that your actions really changed things in terms of addressing the challenges brought on by the pandemic?
Thank you, Steve, for your question. I think this is, I would say, 2 stages. The initial stage where we did not really understood what was going on in terms of what we are supposed to be able to do. We just looked at what everyone is trying to do. What is the main objective? I would say that releasing spectrum and making sure that companies could be able to work from home were the initial stage where we realized that there is no people around the city, mainly in the bigger cities. But as we went out, this is the second stage, we start understanding that rural areas, people are still roaming around a lot. So we had to find ways to, on a second stage, make sure that people have places which they can be safe and use or have access to the internet. USF played a major role on that. TV white spaces and different technologies were adopted around the country on a very speedy and an amazing, I would say, amazing approach by the regulator himself. Being aware how technology is being used, how to deploy, and working with the health institutions to find places where people will be monitored when they're using the service, and also restricting the number of kids that could go to these places. Although, you know, kids, as long as they have got a mobile phone and there's Wi-Fi, they'll just be there, even if you try to chase them out. But people were amazing, I would say. Everybody wearing masks as soon as the World Health Organization let us know. So everybody were wearing masks on their mobile phones, keeping a safe distance, and the police were very polite. There was no physical aggression. Everything started working smoothly. So it was a 2-stage. First stage, MNOs jumped in. Second stage, the Universal Access Fund and the health institutions, they started deploying access to Wi-Fi so that we could cover both people with resources to access the internet and people without resources to access the internet, mostly in the rural areas. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. That was great. At this point, we turn from the regulatory side of the network towards the operators, and you know, I'm really interested to hear the perspective, particularly you know, looking at the same problem from a different point of view, from the point of view of the operators. And so I'd like to welcome Takalani Nechutenje, Chief Officer and Executive Director, External Affairs for Vodacom South Africa. Over to you, Takalani.
Yes, good afternoon to the viewers, and thank you, Steve and team. For us in the Vodacom family, COVID has underscored the importance of closer working relationships between government, the regulators, business, and civil society. And because we are all dealing with a global pandemic, governments, not only in South Africa or Africa, but all over the world, had to take the lead in the process. So as a result, there was a lot of policy and regulatory interventions in order to manage the pandemic and its economic and social consequences. Unfortunately, some of these policies impacted freedom of movement, they impacted freedom of speech, economic activity, and the right to privacy with legal consultation, if any, at all. Of course, we are not complaining because we understand why there was minimal consultation, because we were all racing against time in order to save lives. However, we began to see some policy inconsistencies in content and in implementation. And we also saw some unintended and undesirable consequences in the process. For instance, the telco sector was declared an essential service, but some aspects of the telco value chain were not allowed to operate at the beginning of the lockdown. For instance, our online stores and our physical stores were closed. Our courier services and call centers were also closed, and these had to be reopened at a later stage. And I must attest that the reopening helped because we engaged in constructive discussions with our government. But the adverse effect of this was that this hampered economic activity and the work from home principle. In the next slide, we also saw an upsurge in network traffic, and we had to ask for temporary spectrum from the regulator, which they granted us. The minister also issued the long-awaited rapid deployment policy. Of course, in this world, nothing is for free. The temporary spectrum that the regulator gave us came with obligations, which I will not repeat because the regulator, Dimakato, already spoke about them. However, we honestly welcomed these obligations because we see them as part of accelerating our digital transformation journey, which as Vodacom within the Vodafone family started in 2016. And then lastly, COVID also demonstrated the close relationship between human behavior and the planet, with lesser movement on the roads, on water, and in the skies. There was lesser pollution that was reported. And in the next slide, I talk about our response, which was driven mainly by our digitalization strategy, which is Vision 2025. We adopted our Vision 2025 strategy in 2016, just after the World Economic Forum coined the phrase, the fourth industrial revolution. It started as Vision 2020, and then we upgraded it to Vision 2025. The strategy has 7 pillars, which are underpinned by our commitment to take leadership in technological innovation, our commitment to prioritize customer centricity, and also our decision to become a purpose-led organization where we recognize that we can make profits as a company whilst at the same time we are doing good. For us, the two are not mutually exclusive. So with COVID, we brought our strategy to life in real terms at the pace of the stakeholders, not at our own pace. And then in order to proactively respond to societal and government pain points during the COVID health crisis, which we call phase 1, and to prepare ourselves for phase 2, which is the economic recovery stage, we summarized our Vision 2025 strategy into what we call the COVID 6-point plan. The first pillar of the COVID 6-point plan is ensuring network resilience. And our priority here is also on rural coverage through both mobile and fixed. The second pillar is to accelerate our pace in digitizing government services through zero rating and providing other ICT solutions. Of course, we started zero rating long before COVID as part of digital transformation and our commitment to remove barriers to access. The third pillar is removing barriers to literacy. And here we are talking about literacy in formal education and in informal education. So here I can say that in partnership with your likes of Microsoft, Google, and Cisco, we are ready for blended learning with government. And we also stepped up our response on gender-based violence because during COVID, we saw a spike in gender-based violence, not only in South Africa, but all over the world. The fourth pillar is to accelerate sustainability and digitalization of SMMEs. Here we proactively honor invoices within 3 days of submission. And we are also contributing to easing some of the financial services regulations for SMMEs. The fifth pillar is where we use big data analytics to model the spread of the virus and movement of people by assisting with contact tracing. And here we use aggregated and anonymized data in order to protect the privacy of citizens and the privacy of our customers. And I must say that we see more room for big data analytics in the economic recovery stage. And then lastly, we also promote cashless transactions as part of physical distancing. So outside South Africa, we zero-rated peer-to-peer and mentioned M-Pesa transactions. In South Africa, through our Vodaland platform, we extended loans to SMMEs up to 1.5 million rands because we are now providing financial services. In the next slide, what we did through COVID was to bring our entire purpose to life by recognizing that as we create digital societies, we must not leave anybody behind. So what we started doing here was to create a social contract with our stakeholders, and always remembering that as our operations are growing and we include everybody, it means that we must be mindful that our environmental footprint is increasing, and therefore we must preserve the planet. And in the last slide, we ask a few questions. How do we see the regulatory and policy world after COVID? And we do have a few policy asks. Firstly, in South Africa, we are waiting for permanent assignment of the high demand spectrum, and this process is currently underway. The regulator is driving it. And secondly, as we walk our digitalization journey, we are mainly self-regulating in 4IR. So we expect regulatory and policy interventions on 4IR, and we will participate in this policy and regulatory making process. We are also watching the debate on the nature of the regulator that would be required for digital transformation. And our question is, will it be the current fragmented regulators, or there will be one digital transformation regulator? And we will also participate actively in this debate when it gets formalized. And lastly, with the new normal, we can see that our customer behavior is already changing, and therefore we may see more regulations in this space in order to protect consumers by promoting customer service and data privacy. So this is what we have done, and this is what we anticipate. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comprehensive presentation. It is astounding just how many areas that where changes can be made to improve services. I'm going to come back to a recurring theme in this webinar, and that issue of the release of spectrum. And as a beneficiary of that early release of spectrum, and looking forward to the upcoming auction of spectrum. First of all, how did it change the way you deliver access? How did it change the way you made decisions about infrastructure? And what are your hopes in terms of the upcoming auction? About what are the best outcomes for you in terms of affordability, in terms of access to spectrum, etc.?
Okay, thanks for the question, Steve. We are using the temporary spectrum optimally to bolster network capacity and to relieve the network congestion that came with COVID. Some of you may remember that COVID came at the backdrop of our settlement with the Competition Commission to reduce the cost of data. And the impact of this settlement was 2.7 billion rands for the company. So with the assignment of temporary spectrum, we began to see elasticity in both data consumption and also in voice usage, which offsets the 2.7 billion rands. And our CFO during the annual results said, this is good for revenues. And this is because, you know, when we make these revenues, we have to invest back into the network. So we saw, for instance, the usage per smart device growing up to 75% year on year now during COVID. We now have 13.2 million 4G devices on our network, which is an increase of 30%. And I deliberately mentioned, Steve, here, 4G, because this is where we don't have that spectrum in South Africa, unlike in all the markets where we operate. We have also zero-rated 874 sites so far during this period to provide access mainly to students and to the learners. And for university students, we have also zero-rated sites and also provided discounted data rates in order to remove the barriers to access, especially for the underprivileged. And we've also taken advantage of the 5G spectrum. We have already set up 5G sites in 3 cities across the country, and this is set to grow. The main setback, although with 5G spectrum, is that there are fewer and unaffordable 5G devices in the market, and we also have to upgrade existing towers or roll out new ones. And lastly, unfortunately, I need to say here in the presence of the regulator that we are just disappointed that the December date for the auction of spectrum has now been moved to somewhere around March next year, and we are crossing our fingers that that date does not move again. And we are also worried about media reports that we saw this week that the digital migration to free 700 and 800 bands may be delayed further due to frequency staking. However, Steve, we remain hopeful that with constructive engagements between all the stakeholders, that all will go well. But our big ask to the regulator is, please do not take away the temporary spectrum before you assign the permanent spectrum, because this is going to impact the consumers who are already enjoying the benefits of the temporary spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's access to spectrum is clearly at the root of delivering affordable access to all, and yet the release of spectrum is complicated, right? It's complicated by the desire for revenues to the exchequer, by the process of trying to have a competitive process, and the of trying to use this. And it's with the with rural areas in mind that I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, because technology paradigm that of satellite access. I'd like to introduce Thabo Makaneti, the General Manager of Technical Regulatory Affairs at MultiChoice. And I think it's important to look at the problem of access from a variety of point of views, and particularly looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Thabo.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the attendees to this great webinar. As the introduction went, I'm Thabo Makaneti with MultiChoice, and yes, this is my presentation around our experience during this particular time of the pandemic. I think to kick off, I will begin with a quote from Tony Benn. Tony Benn, who is the former member of parliament in the UK, who said broadcasting is really too important to be left to the broadcasters. I found this to be an interesting quote, but I think it provides a bit of a genesis of why the industry is as heavily regulated as it is. Next slide, please. So talking about the heavily regulated industry, I mean, we have to contend with licensing requirements. We have content regulations as well, regulations such as content classification. We have local content quotas. We have regulations around broadcasting rights of sports and other content related regulations. And for us as pay TV operators who actually produce our own set-top boxes, we also have conformance requirements to deal with, meaning that we have to meet the standards of health and safety and environmental friendliness of all the products that we put out in the market. And we also have universal service obligations. We also have universal service obligations as well, which includes regulations such as masks carry, where we have to carry the public broadcasters channels on our platform. And we also contribute to the Universal Service Fund. And in South Africa, we contribute to the Media Development and Diversity Fund as well. We have other regulations that we have to deal with, but I think over the years we live with these regulations. We find a way around these regulations. Next slide, please. Now, coming to 2020, and we are faced with the pandemic, it becomes business unusual. And it was not the run-in-the-mill business unusual where we have a year or two to prepare for changes that are happening in the market. It happened very quickly. And so one thing that we all realized when we came together as government, as regulators, civil society, that we are really all in this together, and our common goal is to make sure that the pandemic doesn't spread any further. Now, I think government responded well by setting up program work groups around specific focus areas. In the ICT sector, for instance, you had focus areas around mobile networks. We sit in focus area on audiovisual services. We also sit in OTT because we are an OTT platform as well. And we met on a daily basis to discuss the issues around the COVID and what it is that the policymaker needs to do, what it is that the regulator needs to do, and what industry needs to also put forward. So from that, we saw an easing of some regulations from the regulator. I think Dimakato talked about local content regulations. Because it was during a hard lockdown, and even production houses could not actually continue with producing content. So we were quickly running out of content. So those local content regulations had to be eased a bit because we would not be complying with them otherwise. Now, as industry as well, we had to come to the party and contribute to the fight. I mean, one of the things that we did with our DSTV platform was that, you know, the Easter period came during the hard lockdown, and people couldn't go to their respective churches and so on. So what we did, we then launched a number of pop-up channels to cover different religious sectors, so that when people are sitting at home, at least they can continue getting their religious messages. Next slide, please. Now, what did we learn around this? I think one of the biggest lessons for us, and I think Daki mentioned it earlier, that policy and regulation can really adapt very quickly to the current environment. I mean, the normal notion is that policy and regulation moves very slowly. It cannot respond to the changing environment, and in the ICT space, technology changes very quickly, and the view is regulations move very slowly. But I think the pandemic showed us that it is possible for the policy for the policymaker and the regulator to actually make decisions very quickly. But I think also the biggest one was that better decisions really come out of us working together. We had these work groups that we were part of, and we're sharing ideas, and that helped the government in coming up with regulations. That helped us prepare as well. So I think we need to work more closely together, and we had that common goal that we're gunning for. Now, there is also a view in many local markets that global OTTs are very hard to reach. It's very difficult to regulate them. But I think during the pandemic, we saw them coming to the party as well. I mean, in the OTT working group, we had Netflix there, we had Google there with YouTube. There was a number of engagements happening between the government and Facebook. So we saw a lot of that, and we saw that they are willing to come to the party. Next slide, please. Final slide. I think when we look at the future, our common goal post the pandemic, I think it's very clear to everyone that we have to rebuild our respective economies. We have to get the economies to work. We have to get people back to work, and so on. So I think coming out of the COVID and looking at that common goal, policymakers, the regulators, the industry and civil society, we have to be more closer together. We have to engage much more regularly. I think engage more, even over and above the policy and regulatory making processes, because currently we engage mostly during those processes, but I think we have to share knowledge on a consistent basis. And also, I think policy and regulation should be fluid. We have seen that it's possible to be fluid. It should be less cumbersome and should be able to adapt to ever-changing environments. We are in the heart of 4IR, we have AI, we have blockchain, we have all these technologies, and they're moving faster and faster. So I think the policy and regulation should be fluid and rather talk to innovation, so that industry can innovate without having to focus too much on complying to regulations. And for me, that is it. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Thabo. I think your point is extremely well taken about the need for more nimble regulation not just in the face of the pandemic, but also in the face of rapid technological change. Are there specific changes for you as a satellite operator that would enable you right now to be able to deliver more effectively on your mandate? Are there specific requests you would make to for changes that that would lower the barriers for you?
Yeah, Steve, I still say that we need to work very closely together between us and the regulator. I think between industry and the regulator. Share ideas, because as industry, we're on the ground. We're in the face of technological advancements. We get disrupted all the time. We know what is there. So I think it's important for us to be much closer together with the regulator. And I think another point as well, I mean, MultiChoice, we operate across 50 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And you find we have to deal with regulations from all the different countries that we operate in. There are certain regulations, I think, regulations such as conformance on equipment. There are some regulations where I think even the regulators from the continent could come together and make it easier for businesses, for industry in the continent to operate well. So I think not just locally. Locally, yes, we have to focus on very fluid regulations. We have to come together, but I think throughout the continent as well, if we're going to develop the continent to the direction that we want it to go, I think regulators have to work much closer together themselves as regulators and with industry as well.
That's a great point. And in fact, it plays into a question that was raised by an attendee about coordination and commonalities across regulators in the region. Once we finish our presentations, I'm going to come back to that, and hopefully we can dig into it a bit deeper. So thank you very much. And now, last but not least, we turn to Oyeronke Oyotunde, Head of Regulatory Affairs for MTN. Looking forward to this.
Good afternoon, participants. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to participate in this webinar. And what I'll be doing is sharing at least 5 focus areas for us from in addressing the pandemic from an MTN perspective. And I'll be dropping in a few key lessons that we've learned over in one or two of those areas. And then I'll be closing with my views on how the pandemic has impacted regulation, and also how we can ensure that we don't leave anyone behind with regard to telephony services, with regard to the digital economy. So let's start off with number one. The first thing I'd like to address is with regard to ensuring network stability and continuity of services in accordance with our license conditions. I think this was very key for us. And part and parcel of that was definitely, it was envisaged that a lot of the online activities, a lot of the fact that people would be making massive demands on data services would put additional strain on our network resources. And as a result of that, one of the things that we did, which I mean, quite a lot of the speakers have mentioned, is the fact that we applied for and were able to secure spectrum assignments to ensure the continuity of our services and to maintain a relatively qualitative service and experience for our subscribers. So particularly in South Africa, we're able to get assignments in the 700, 800, 2.3, 700, 800 megahertz, 2.3 gigahertz and 2.6 gigahertz, as well as to support our operations. In Zambia, we were able to also get an assignment of the 800 megahertz spectrum. Temporary assignments, all these assignments were temporary assignments just to support what we already have. And I must say, the temporary spectrum grants were very useful. We find that one of our other operations in Southern Africa was Eswatini. They did not really need, they were offered, but they did not take up the offer for spectrum. And they've been able to cope and manage with what they already have, leveraging on network efficiencies. The key thing for us is, I think it was wonderful to see how government, regulators and operators were able to come together to agree on the best way forward in a very short period of time. I think that spectrum resource is something that needs to be put into our playbook going forward whenever we have pandemics such as this to address constraints. And I do also agree with, if I may agree with my colleague from Vodacom, that in South Africa in particular, because of the way things have gone, it is important that the regulator, ICASA, does not withdraw the temporary spectrum grant until the spectrum auction next year. I think it's very important to ensure that we have that continuity of service. And as things stand, one of the things that we need to know, even though we've moved, say for example, in South Africa we've moved down to stage 1. Quite a lot of people are still working from home. There is still that strain on additional data traffic on our network. So it's something which we need to continue. We will need that additional spectrum up until the time that full commercial activities have resumed. And I must commend the South African government and ICASA for the way they've handled and for the way they've been able to engage with operators and key stakeholders to ensure the best possible protocol and framework. The second point I'd like to make is with regard to disseminating vital information for both from operators and from governments. I think this for us, from an operator's perspective, is a low-hanging fruit. It's what we normally do anyway. And it was not just in South Africa, but in quite a lot of countries. In our own experience from MTN, all 21 countries in which we operate, in all of our 21 operations in the 21 countries in which we operate, we're able to assist government, particularly in this area, to ensure that we're able to deliver timely information directly to devices of various subscribers and the citizenry at large. And I think also in Uganda, we're able to support, in quite a number of countries such as Uganda, we're able to support we're able to support initiatives such as fact checkers and things like that. With regards to connecting vital services, I think that was one of the key things that we were able to leverage on. In a number of countries, they actually had emergency communication systems, which were definitely leveraged immediately. So we had special service line call centers that were put in place to support government efforts in this regard. With regards to helping host communities, I think there were quite a lot of initiatives. I think it's been mentioned in South Africa that there were zero-rated data services to educational sites for students studying from home. There were digital classrooms. We were able to support digital classrooms, e-libraries. We were able to also support connectivity for academic institutions like universities and so on. And in certain respects, we actually provided devices to support those who were not able to who did not have tablets and e-textbooks and so on, and other materials. In quite a number of countries, say for example in Uganda, we're able to support mobile money transactions. And there we were, our mobile money customers were able to send mobile money, we were able to have mobile money transactions free of charge. And also, with regards to subscribers who had to work from home, in certain respects, we're able to also provide specific, in certain countries, we're able to provide specific products and services to support their 9-to-5 working from home and data demand. So we were able to support that in terms of reducing the cost of providing data services for certain subscribers. With regards to, we were also, and I think I want to also reiterate the fact that big data is a big issue. Big data will help support. Big data is very useful. Big data, artificial intelligence has a key role to play in monitoring issues such as the pandemic. And I think we have two main examples of where we had collaborative projects working with government, international organizations, and other operators to provide aggregated, anonymized data support to address the pandemic. I want to mention, say, for example, the UNECA's Africa COVID Communications Information Platform, which we supported to ensure that we're able to provide USSD, IVR, and SMS service as a platform for government to communicate with citizenry, provide information, to provide information dissemination, information gathering, and to support the government decision-making and resource allocation. In such, we weren't able to do it particularly in Southern Africa, but we've been able to pilot the initiative in Congo-Brazzaville, which is in Congo-Brazzaville. And there are hopes that it would be spread around, it would also be replicated in quite a number of other countries. The point I want to make here is the fact that with the benefit of hindsight, there is a need to establish platforms such as this in conjunction with stakeholders across the board, not just to support government issues, but also to balance the confidentiality of consumer data to ensure that there's a legitimate use of data, and there's a way to ensure that the public interest in ensuring that the pandemic is mitigated, the rigors of the pandemic is mitigated, also to make sure that the interest of the public interest in mitigating the pandemic, as well as in ensuring, in preserving the confidentiality of consumer data is well balanced. Key issues for us is the fact that I think we need to go back to the drawing board in quite a lot of countries to ensure that we have established protocols and processes for this, to address issues such as this whenever they arise. And I think that is very, very key. In view of the fact, just addressing the point, just a point on whether or not the pandemic has changed the way I think about telecommunications and regulation, I think that it underscores the fact that telecommunications in quite a lot of countries is a critical national infrastructure. And for that reason, there's a need to protect not just our facilities, but also ensuring that we are brought into quite a lot of the decision-making process, just as was done in South Africa, whenever issues such as these arise. The second point I also want to make is the fact that there's a need to also ensure that we continually educate consumers about the safety of our telecommunications. I'm referring particularly to the 5G misinformation that spread across the board when this pandemic arose. And we need to address that issue to ensure that people feel safe when it comes to telecommunications, and the fact that we're talking about reaching unserved and underserved areas. There's a need to roll out. There's a need to cover network coverage gaps in our network. And as a result of that, we will probably be getting closer and closer to people doing rolling out fiber, making sure that we have pico, femtocells in various places. And as a result of it, we need to make sure that we address health concerns. Apart from that, in reaching unserved areas, I think the key thing for us is to ensure that in many countries, they have universal service funds, access service funds. These funds need to be put to good use in reaching unserved and underserved areas. Such funds will help to subsidize outreach to such areas. Apart from that, there are also other initiatives that quite a lot of operators are putting into place, things like projects that involve maybe low-cost rollout of technologies. There's one in particular that MTN is party to, the Telecoms Infrastructure Project, using Open RAN technology. And we're partnering with quite a number of other operators as well as service providers in ensuring that we pioneer this technology in places like maybe Zambia. And we also have in other regions in Uganda and in Conakry, where we're able to bring 2G, 3G, and 4G connectivity to rural areas. I think such schemes need to be encouraged. In addition to maybe the point that was made whereby you need to license small operators. I think large operators can also provide such services, but it's just making sure that we're able to roll out low-cost technologies, and that's it. I think I better stop at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, that comprehensive presentation, which covered a range of issues. We've got a lot, I think, to discuss amongst us, and I think if we can have all the speakers on screen now, we can get into a few questions. And I'd like to start with one that was posed by one of the participants, which was asking or commenting on the commonality of challenges and responses by regulators, and asking and pointing out that we are in a time that is unprecedented. I mean, not since 1918 has anyone had to deal with an issue like this, and now we have telecommunications that does enable us to deal with it, but we're making it up, right? We're inventing it all as we go along, and so the question was, how are we learning from each other? How are we ensuring that good practice emerges as quickly as possible? Now, the question I would pose to you is, where have you had the biggest value? Is it from regional bodies like like CRASA serving Southern Africa, continental bodies like the African Telecommunications Union? I know they recently, or about a month ago, did a webinar on spectrum and access, or at the ITU level, where the ITU has also marshaled an international response. How do you think we can best and most quickly leverage learning from each other? What's the best way forward? And it's open to anyone who would like to reply.
If I may go first, can I? I think definitely, from my perspective, I think it's at all levels. At the ITU level, at industry, at the global industry level, we're talking about the GSMA and the GSA, regional bodies, like say, for example, the African Union, say, for example, what UNECA has been doing. There's a lot of dialogue that needs to take place. With the benefit of hindsight, in view of what has transpired over the last, maybe we would say about 7 to 8 months, I think we have a lot of learnings which we need to bring to the table. There needs to be developed a set of protocols of how to address issues such as this whenever they arise. We need to know what to do, because I think at the initial stage, we weren't quite sure what to do. Operators were being approached. We were being approached, say, for example, by various NGOs, international organizations, service providers, as to what solutions we could put forward to support. At the end of the day, we had to look to government to provide the lead. And I think that's where we need to sit, with governments, with our regulators. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on this issue?
Hi, Steve. Hi, Dimagatu here. Am I audible? Okay. So I think it's a bit of everything that you've said, because I think for the regulator in South Africa, the benefit was the fact that we already had spectrum that was earmarked for high-speed connectivity, which is the one that's going to be auctioned. So for us, really, it was an easy, quick win for us to then, avail the spectrum that's going to be auctioned. But I think, as you rightfully say, there is a role to be played by the likes of CRASA and the ATU and ATU in terms of regional coordination, because you find that even though we may have started in our own individual countries to start, meeting up the challenges that the pandemic is bringing, but then the regional bodies then were quick enough to then pick up and then ensure coordination among the countries. So I think there is a huge role to be played by regional bodies, as well as the ITU as well, because then that's where everything is coordinated from a global point of view. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to come in on this?
Yes,
or go ahead.
I have a comment, Steve. Listening to everything that we have been discussing, so far, I think every country just adopted what measures they could take, because there was no time to start consulting with each other because it was an emergency. But the point is that we may find ourselves here again in the future. And we have a very good platform where we can feed in the information that we have, which is the World Telecommunication Development Conference, which is going to take place next year, because it deals with development issues. It's one of the major ITU conferences, and it deals with development. And my thinking is that because we've got study groups that feed into that conference, it is very important. We didn't have a study question that was dealing with emergencies of this nature. We have, of course, something that deals with emergency telecommunications in the sense of the technologies, but on on the policy side, we may need to now feed into that and see that when the next set of questions are formulated for study for the next 4 years, this is taken into account, and maybe we have a question that specifically deals with this so that we don't get caught by surprise again. And it's a fantastic platform for all ideas to come through. And perhaps even for those organizations that we are talking about, the NGOs, to take an interest in the work of the WTDC. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, then I'd like to move on to another question. And prior to to our start today, Andrew said, you know, that it was my responsibility as a moderator not to let anyone off the hook too easily. And so I'm going to ask one question, and which is a little bit provocative, but you know, feel free to address it in any way you like. I've participated, as I'm sure have many of you, in any number of webinars since the pandemic began, and many of them begin with the sort of, you know, it's not business as usual. You know, everything has changed, but to be honest, some of it, you know, it feels like business as usual. In that when we, you know, that we're only as strong as our weakest link, does it not now behoove us in response to the pandemic to focus more on inclusion as regulators and operators? And if so, I mean, does that shift our focus? I mean, does it shift our focus in technology? I mean, 5G technology is very interesting, but it's not a technology that is really focused on digital inclusion, right? You know, it's not one that's going to enable the poor, it's going to enable the very latest state-of-the-art technologies. So I'd like to, you know, to ask you, where, you know, is there not just small changes, but are there fundamental changes in the way we think about telecommunications that are going to change things for us going forward? And open to anyone to address that. Just put your hand up if you'd like to come in on that. Don't everybody shout at once. Tabo.
You know, I think if you attend a lot of the ITU conferences and ITU meetings, this is kind of exactly the issue that is discussed there. This thing can never be tackled with just one technology. You know, I mean, in the previous WRC, there was a lot of spectrum that was allocated to the mobiles around 5G. Now, with satellite operators as well, they use a lot of the spectrum as well. So there's this back and forth. However, I mean, this is not, in our area of operations, we don't live where one technology solves all the problems. 5G is not going to solve all the problems. Satellite certainly doesn't solve all the problems. But if we find ways to combine these technologies together, to work together around different sectors, it becomes so much easier to then deal with the inclusion issue. You know, yeah, I think let me just leave it there.
Thank you. Takalani, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Steve. I hope you can hear me. COVID, and I think you mentioned this in your opening remarks, that COVID actually catapulted us to the 4IR era faster than we anticipated. Before COVID, we were all having engagements in our different capacities about the impact of 4IR on society. But we did not want to rock the boat because the saying was that we did not want to leave anybody behind. So we were trading with care. And I think COVID has now presented an opportunity for us where we need to say, what is the next phase? And for me, the next phase is how do we leverage the gains that we have made already during COVID in order to rebuild the economies and address the digital divide, as you mentioned, because as I'm listening to all the speakers, the common denominator amongst all of us is that during this crisis, we were all able to rise to the challenge and work towards the common objective. And therefore, let us step back and ask ourselves, from a telco point of view or from a technology point of view, what is the biggest threat that is facing us now? And the biggest threat is known to all of us. It is the digital divide. Let us all now tackle this head on by ensuring that through partnerships, each one of us, bring our own areas of strength. We would want to expect governments, the policymakers, to come with pragmatic public policies. We would want to expect the regulators to do the same and come with pragmatic regulations that will create a conducive environment for us to operate as the operators. And that is where we need more engagements in terms of what is the kind of regulatory environment that we want to see, and how do we ensure that there is inclusion for all. And this can only happen if we all recognize that technology is an enabler. Technology is a tool for development. And if we put it to good use, it can address our societal challenges.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else like to respond to that? Does, Toboko? Was that your hand up?
Thank you, Steve. I think based on what the fellow panelists have been deliberating on, I think it's very clear that most of us are managing in terms of our network capacity and the upgrades and all that, and we are surviving. But I think at the end of it all, we all have to reflect, like Taiki has just said, we have to reflect on how we've been regulating. All our frameworks that we've been using, probably we have to re-look at them and see whether they're still relevant in the current times. And also the sticky issues that we have to now go back to the drawing board and focus on would be the issue of safety, the issue of security, the issue of education, like we've already discussed. And as well, the other issue would be affordability, because now we are moving everything online. We are talking 5G, but would the people afford? So I think those are the key things that we need to now look at going forward. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the fact that we're coming to the end of our webinar period. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Andrew for some final comments and to bring us to a close.
Thank you very much, Steve. Again, just to tie back to the beginning, what an extraordinary moment in time to be a regulator. What an extraordinary moment in time to be an operator. And as the Mosaic Beacon regulator said, and to do so in a gentlemanly manner. I think that was the unusual element that the pandemic brought about. Regulators could extend additional rights to operators, and operators could meet obligations pursuant to those rights in a gentlemanly manner. And I think that was probably one of the key takeouts of the conversation. I am delighted to do two more tasks. The one task is let's see, there is a pitch for membership. Those slides will come on, but just before we do, I really do just want to draw your attention again that there will be two more webinars, one on West Africa. That date is scheduled for November the 10th. And then there will be a similar webinar for East Africa and the date will be scheduled sometime in January, and we will send you notifications in that regard. The only other invitation really is for everyone on this webinar to consider membership with the IIC. Now, if you go to the IIC website, you will get a sense of what the membership options are. So the point is whether you are a regulator, policymaker, industry player, there is an opportunity for you to become part of the IIC in some form or the other. There are 3 good reasons why, I do want to encourage you both to go to the website, but I will also follow this up with an individualized email to yourselves so that there be an opportunity for Q&A and discussions as to what membership may mean to you, the benefit you may derive from it. Lastly, I really just do want to thank the speakers. Thank you very much for the manner in which you participated as a panelist, your ideas, your thoughts, and I do want to thank the moderator. Thank you, Steve, for moderating so efficiently and so effectively. So on behalf of the IIC, to all speakers, to the moderator, thank you very much. And to everyone else that has signed on to the webinar, you've given us 2 hours of your time, and in exchange, you received information, you've received opportunities for networking, and we hope all in all that at the end of the day, you will say this was your 2 hours well spent. This concludes the webinar on regulation in times of pandemic and lessons for the future. The African response, which is a Southern African one. I hope to see you log on to the next one when we have the other 2 regional voices from Africa heard on this matter. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next time.